We're very pleased to bring him back to Harvard Bookstore tonight. Please join me in welcoming James Carroll.
Thank you, Alex, very much for the welcome and for all you did to arrange this evening. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. You honor me with your presence. I have to, of course, begin by acknowledging and thanking Jeff Mayerson, the owner of this wonderful bookstore. I have published all these books, and I never publish a book until I've come and presented it at the Harvard Bookstore. It's been true from the beginning of my life as a writer. And so I'm really deeply grateful to Jeff and his wonderful predecessor, Frank Kramer, and all of the people that make this such a special bookstore. I know everyone here joins me in loving it and in being profoundly grateful for it. And mostly when I'm in public events for this book, it isn't quite the right thing, although I have the impulse often to begin by acknowledging my deep and loving debt of gratitude to my wife, Alexandra Marshall. But because she shares with me a history of presenting her work at the Harvard Bookstore and shares with me a deep love for this place, knows some of you, and shares in the weight of what this book has been in my life, I'll take this opportunity to thank you, Lexa, and to acknowledge my deep gratitude to you for all that I have put of our life together into this book. So, this book is about the lethal feedback loop between the actual city of Jerusalem and the apocalyptic fantasy that it inspires. It is a book, therefore, about two Jerusalems, the earthly and the heavenly, the mundane and the imagined. That doubleness shows up in the tension between Christian Jerusalem and Jewish Jerusalem, between European Jerusalem and Islamic Jerusalem, between Israeli Jerusalem and Palestinian Jerusalem, and between the city on a hill and the Messiah nation that, beginning with John Winthrop, understands itself in its terms. But all recognizably contemporary conflicts have their buried foundations in the deep past, and this book will excavate them. Always, the story will curve back to the real place, the story of how humans living on the ridge, about a third of the way between the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean, have constantly been undermined by the overheated dreams of pilgrims who, age in and age out, arrive at the legendary gates with love in their hearts, the end of the world in their minds, and weapons in their hands. And one of those pilgrims once was me. And I'll tell you that story, and I'll just speak for a few minutes and hope that we can have a conversation, because the truth is this book raises questions and deals with questions about which almost everyone in this room has knowledge, conviction, and passion. So I look forward to the conversation. But before doing that, let me just say how I came to Jerusalem and how I participated, without knowing it, in a deep, ancient tradition of what I call in this book Jerusalem fever. I was infected with it myself, this tendency to think of Jerusalem as a screen onto which to project fantasies of another world, or a better world, or the world ahead, or the end of the world. And Jerusalem fever is the disease, the main victims of which are the people who live in the actual city, who are always at the mercy of the fantasies other people bear of it. And this is in a very powerful way, a Christian story. It's also a Jewish and Muslim story. It's a Western story. It's a story an inch below the surface of the lives that we lead, even as Americans. And I'll try to give a hint of that now. So this wonderful 18th century painting that is on the cover, of course, shows the Dome of the Rock. And you all know that the Dome of the Rock on the noble sanctuary, or as Jews refer to it, the Temple Mount, is regarded as standing over the rock, which is remembered as having been, in the beginning, the rock unto which Abraham was to bind Isaac for the sacrifice of his beloved son until the last moment when God rescued Isaac by staying Abraham's hand. It's remembered as the rock then over which the Holy of Holies of the Temple of Solomon was built. It's even remembered, although there's absolutely no reason for it to be remembered this way. We're in the land of myth here now, as the rock on which the cross, the crucifix, was erected. Of course, we know that Golgotha is not in this place. In the Talmud, that rock is remembered as the birthplace of Adam. Muslims remember that rock as the place from which Muhammad was ascended into heaven in the company of the angel Gabriel. And there are reasons to believe, according to archaeologists, that before any of this, so before Abraham, who dates to, if he dates at all, 4,000 years ago. I mean, David is remembered as having founded the city of Jerusalem 3,000 years ago. Jebusites lived there before that. Palestinians and Arabs remember the Jebusite origins of Jerusalem. But even before history, so, not far away from this, it's not unrelated, not far away from this place, human beings invented writing, which is the beginning of history. So even before history, this place, in all likelihood, was a holy place to which sacrifices were brought. The story begins with sacrifice, which is not simply, as we moderns think of it, a kind of primitive impulse to bring living things, animals, even humans, to the deity. It's not a simply grotesque activity that needs to be, at best, related to symbolically, as in the Catholic sacrifice of the Mass. No, it's actually, there's something deeply human about the impulse to sacrifice, and it lives on in us, whether we acknowledge it or not. What did I know about sacrifice, and what brought me to Jerusalem? Well, jump back with me for a quick minute. It's the spring of 1960. I'm a senior in high school, in Wiesbaden High School in Germany, a high school run by the United States Air Force, where my father is stationed. Wiesbaden, and we high school kids were intensely aware of this, is less than 100 miles from what was then the Iron Curtain. Wiesbaden Air Base was, as they referred to themselves, the point of the spear. The jet fighters and tactical bombers that were based at Wiesbaden Air Base were going to be the first respondents to the expected invasion of the Soviet armies coming across the Iron Curtain. Everyone understood that the conventional superiority of the Soviets was so superior, was so overwhelming, that there was no question that Europeans, NATO, anyone would be able to stop those many brigades of tanks, those many battalions of soldiers. The Soviet army was invincible. The only chance that Europe had to withstand it was the threat of a nuclear strike coming from the United States of America. Why should the Europeans believe that America would embark on the end of the world, World War III nuclear holocaust to save France and Germany? We used to talk about this at the cafeteria over French fries and our surreptitious cigarettes. One of the ways we put the question was, Jesus, this close to the Iron Curtain, 15 minutes after the next war begins, we're all We didn't use the expression. We might have said toast. We're all toast. We would have been literally toast. We understood that we were the first, we were going to be dead before they knew in Washington that the attack had come. And we used to ask the question, I understand why our dad's here, but what's mom and what are my brothers and what are we doing here? This is like right next to the battleground. This is it. And I remember very distinctly the afternoon when some kid said, we're the sacrificial lambs. And we took it apart. We're the people, we're on the altar. We get killed. The promise that America has made to Europe, to to Germany, well, yes, Japan, the nuclear umbrella, the promise they've made is we will strike as if they've attacked us. Well, when they attack the Germans, the first people to die are us. We're the Americans who guarantee the American nuclear retaliation, which made us feel sort of important. I can remember a kind of rush of patriotic feeling. I felt a little bit like we should be getting some recognition here. And that spring, the reason it was an issue was because that was the spring when the Soviets shot down Gary Power's U-2 plane. It was so vivid to us because my first experience of the dishonesty and the deceit of the United States government, which became a long-time theme then, my first experience of it was that week when President Eisenhower presided over an American lie about the weather plane. I believed it because the government said it. And I remember in that cafeteria saying to another kid, no, the Soviets lie. That's what this is all about. We don't do that. They do that. They believe the ends justify the means. We don't do that. And the kid said to me, the U-2 took off from Turkey and it was flying to Wiesbaden Air Base. It was supposed to land at our air base and I know that because my father is a mechanic on it. And he was talking about this at the table. That's no weather plane. My father, Master Sergeant so-and-so, who's a chief mechanic on the U-2, is telling his kid it's no weather plane. His kid is telling me, and I'm saying it's got to be a weather plane. Otherwise, everything I believe about the United States goes up in smoke, which it did. But the point I'm making is that's the beginning of sacrifice. It may seem a long way from Jerusalem, but it isn't, because what it defined for me was the core truth of American nuclear, the cult of American nuclear deterrence, which was a cult of sacrifice. It was profoundly violent and profoundly religious. We, as a nation, built our life and our world and our politics and our economy around the readiness to destroy the world in order to save it. Better dead than red was not a crackpot slogan. It was the nutshell of American foreign policy. And that is an apocalyptic idea that began in Jerusalem, which I didn't know at the time. It's the core idea of the book of Revelation, which sees the end time as a massive Armageddon, violence in the streets, a eternal lake of fire, God coming down with Jesus, whom I remembered as a pacifist. What did I know? Jesus coming down as the head of an army, wreaking havoc as a way to redeem the world. And that was the beginning. I thought when I was really infected with nuclear dread, nuclear fever, if you want, I fled from my first ambition to be an Air Force officer and entered the seminary and embraced religion because I thought in my youth that religion was the opposite of violence. And you all know the history. I was, of course, stripped of that naive conviction bit by bit and fairly quickly over the next decade of the 60s. First reckoning with the Christian failure during the Holocaust, when I understood not only that there was this bystander phenomenon of Christianity, but that some of Christianity's core ideas prepared the ground for Hitler, not just anti-Judaism, which morphed into anti-Semitism, but this millennial notion that the death of the Jews is Act 1 in the return of the Messiah, the end time, and the achievement of salvation for everybody. Why did the Jews have to be converted? because the conversion of the Jews in Jerusalem is step one of the return of the Messiah. And the elimination of Jews and Judaism through conversion morphed over the centuries into the elimination of Jews, however. It's a religious idea. It's a demonic idea, but it's a religious idea. And it's embedded in the book of Revelation, also known, of course, as Apocalypse. Apocalyptic thinking is a pillar of the American military imagination. And that's a preoccupation of mine. And it was really an adventure in understanding and the liberation that comes from understanding to actually look at where this began, sacrifice. And I made a magnificent discovery. My prejudice, I'm a religious person, but nevertheless, and I have a life now as a critic of religion, and my prejudice was that religion was the problem somehow. And what I understood in reading this history, in writing this history, reading all histories I could, was that what's magnificent about Jerusalem is, yes, it's the cockpit of violence. Yes, it's the place where empires of old intersected, went to war with each other. Yes, it was the place of savage, violent impulses carried to the nth degree, the ethnic cleansing, we didn't, in our terms, of the Babylonians who sought to eliminate the people of Israel by kidnapping them away from Jerusalem. And when the people of Israel were kidnapped away from Jerusalem in Babylon, 587, the 6th century BCE, so only yesterday, closer to us than it is to Abraham, if he existed, that it was in Babylon that the people understood something new about themselves, that their enemy, the Babylonians, were people with whom they shared the most important thing, which is the oneness of God. And it was then that they began to organize their texts, traditions, oral traditions, their poems, their songs, their ideological tales to account for various parts of their life, the texts that define every tribe, community, nation. They began to organize their story in a way to make the point of what they had learned, which is, it's only now in this 6th century that we find the beginning of what we know as the Bible. And in the Bible, they arranged their memories in such a way to say what they learned. And what they learned first was that the God they worship, and usually this is put in terms of a triumph of the one God over the other gods, as if that's what monotheism is. It isn't. It's the insight that the God we worship is actually everybody's God. Therefore, we have an obligation to regard everyone with respect. That's what, it's not, monotheism is a terrible word for it. It's actually an 18th century word. Ism is the tip-off. It isn't monotheism, it's the oneness of God. It's the oneness that every human being is capable of coming to somehow or other in his or her own way. And these people came to it in their way in relationship to Jerusalem. It was in looking back at Jerusalem by the rivers of Babylon. We sat down and wept when we thought of you, O Zion. And it was in Jerusalem they realized that they had had this experience of this God, which made it unthinkable that they should honor the other gods that they were encountering in Babylon. So when the Babylonian regime lost its power, lost its grip, of course, they did the unexpected thing. They went back to Jerusalem. They rebuilt their temple, but now with a huge difference that embodies the difference in who they were. Because now when they rebuilt the temple of Solomon, and they constructed the Holy of Holies, maybe over the rock here, because the Ark of the Covenant, whatever that was, maybe some relic of the tablets of Moses, no one knows, but the Ark of the Covenant, their sacred object, the sacred object around which they had organized their religion and their identity, the Ark of the Covenant was lost in the Babylonian destruction. They didn't have it anymore. It had been the raison d'etre of the temple. Guess what the raison d'etre of the temple was now? The vacancy of the Holy of Holies. They created the Holy of Holies and it was empty. The only Holy of Holies in the ancient world. that was empty. That's where representations of the deity were put. They didn't have one. This people didn't even speak the name of the deity because they had come to this profound insight. This is what monotheism, this is what gets lost in our cavalier discussions of the insight was this God whom we worship is unknowable, and this God's unknowability is the only thing we can know about it, which is knowledge. And in that paradox, this religion and the Bible is born. People complain because the Bible is so full of violence. There are more than 1,000 passages that speak of God's ferocious anger and readiness. There are, in the beautiful Psalms, there are verses about smashing babies' heads up against the rock. What is this? And in our enlightened way, we are offended by this. The violence is in the Bible because violence is the Bible's subject. Because this people, having suffered violence, having inflicted violence themselves, understood that violence was the question. And so the stories that they began to tell are organized in a way that take directly the problem of violence. Therefore, that story about Abraham and Isaac. Human sacrifice was ubiquitous in the ancient world. We know that Greek tragedy, for example, 500 years after Babylon, is defined by the sacrifice of children. The sacrifice of children was common throughout the ancient world into the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st centuries. And we know in the Western Hemisphere, the sacrifice of human beings and young people in particular continued into the 16th century at least. And we know, if we think about it, if we read Wilfred Owen, think about what actually happens in our wars, the sacrifice of sons and daughters is still part of our cultural assumption. The Isaac-Abraham story is this people saying no to that. The God we worship forbids it, actually. The other thing about this God they've suddenly discovered is this God, unlike the others, does not make alliances with those in power. This God identifies with the victims of power. Therefore, with Isaac. Therefore, with all the scapegoats. And this impulse comes to a kind of fulfillment for us Christians in understanding the story of Jesus in its terms. A scapegoat who is, we don't know much about the historical Jesus, but one thing we do know is he was radically committed to nonviolence. He made a public campaign of it. And of course, that campaign took him to Jerusalem. The only place that his story could have taken him was Jerusalem. And of course, that's because Babylon, by the time of Jesus and the decades after Jesus, Jerusalem is at the mercy of the next savage war, which is gone from the Christian memory, nearly gone actually from the Jewish memory too. People do not pay attention to what the Roman war against the Jews was. Between 70 and 135, the numbers are inevitably imprecise, but between Josephus and Tacitus, the indications are that the Romans killed in 70, in the 2 years around the destruction of the temple, somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million Jews. The second phase of the war, around 135, more than 1 million Jews. So between 70 and 135, millions of Jews. Jews everywhere in the Mediterranean world were targeted. It wasn't genocide in that Hitler sense because these people were being targeted for how they behaved, their refusal to participate in Roman life to the ways in which the emperor required. But nevertheless, the violence against the Jewish people in that period was, well, it would only be surpassed in the 20th century. Why is that important? Because it was out of that violence that Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism were born after the destruction of the temple. What is it to be a Jew without the temple? The destruction of the temple gave every Jew, including the Jesus people, an identity crisis. The answer that the Rabbinic Jews offered was, now without the temple priesthood, we more than ever devote ourselves to study of Torah and observance of the law. The synagogue is the center of our religious life, together with the home table of Shabbat. And Shabbat becomes the central religious organizing symbol. Jesus for the Christians, for the Jesus people, is the new temple. That's simple. We don't need the old temple. In fact, from now on, the denigration of what remains of the old temple is part of how we prove what we say about Jesus. We say to Jews who reject what we believe, look at the temple. Look what God did to the temple because of your rejection of Jesus. And this is a defining event for Western civilization, because the Christian theological need to have Jews absent from the temple and from Jerusalem puts in place the myth of the wandering Jew. The Jew will wander until the end time, when the Jew will be brought back to Jerusalem to be converted or killed in the salvation, the last act, the climactic act of salvation history. Just in parenthesis, this is why the Vatican was radically opposed to the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. It wasn't simple rejection of the Zionist claim. It was a theological position, complicated. So, because I'm speaking briefly, I'll just say now, etc., etc., etc. Down through the centuries, Constantine, the revalorizing of Jerusalem with the discovery there of the true cross, the loss of Jerusalem to Islamic armies. Why was it that the first place that the Islamic armies went 5 years after the death of the prophet was to Jerusalem, which they took nonviolently, by the way? And Muslims invited Jews back to the city that Christians had controlled. Christians experienced the city as lost. And they did then what the Jews had done, which is begin to long for it and fantasize about it. Jews were praying next year in Jerusalem. Christians had their own version of the same nostalgia. And it defined European Christendom just as it took form. And the first thing European Christendom did when it accumulated sufficient power was attack Jerusalem to take it back. And you know the almost 300-year period of the Crusades were all about the European desperation to get Jerusalem back, which set in motion an unfinished European fixation on that place. When Christopher Columbus sailed west in 1492, I tell you, he says in his own chronicles, his motive was not material. It wasn't just the gold in the Indies he was after. It was Jerusalem. And 100 and some odd years later, when the dissenters left Great Britain to come to the New World to establish the millennial kingdom that would bring about the return of the Messiah, they were understanding what they did in terms of, as Winthrop put it, the city on a hill. Jerusalem. Bostonians vainly think of the City on a Hill speech as having been delivered in Boston Harbor. It wasn't. Does anyone know where it was delivered? Well, it's not certain where on that voyage it was delivered, but do you know where that ship, the Arbella, first dropped anchor in the New World? Salem! They got off the ship, they had their sermon, they established their town. What is Salem? It's another name for Jerusalem. When the dissenters in Salem broke from the larger community, they went away to establish their own new city on a hill, and what did they call it? Salem, New Hampshire. Why is there a Salem, Massachusetts, and a few miles away a Salem, New Hampshire? Salem, Zion, Jerusalem, variants on the name Jerusalem, the most common place name in the United States of America. A fixation that came and went, ebbed and flowed down through the centuries. In the 19th century, it came back with a flourish in America, defining us, frankly. Because the violence, again, it's a story about violence. The violence of the Civil War, savage violence, to be compared with the Roman violence in the Roman War against the Jews. 700,000 American men, almost all men, killed in less than 5 years. A percentage of population today, 7 million. Drew Faust's book, eloquent on this. What was it to lose 7 million people killed by their brothers and cousins? And how do we ever justify this? Union wasn't enough. Union was the reason for that war. And it was only into the war, Antietam, late summer, 1863, 24,000 casualties in less than 12 hours, that Lincoln understood that Union was no longer morally grave enough to justify this war. the freedom of the slaves, the Emancipation Proclamation, promulgated a few months later, was the only thing that could justify the slaughter that was clearly going to be taking place now. And it was in that summer that we got the anthem that enabled us to believe it. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. And is it a coincidence that the one presiding over this, well, yes, it is a coincidence, let's be clear, was Abraham. And is it a coincidence that Abraham, his last words whispered to his wife at Ford's Theater, she reported to the minister the next morning, were they had been talking about what they would do now that the war was over and when he would be free to travel. His last words were, I think I should like to go to Jerusalem. Important not to make more of that than is required, but there it is. And is it a mere coincidence that the day he said that, the day he died, the last day of the war, the day the Confederate flag came down in Mobile, was Good Friday? And that Sunday, Easter Sunday, all over the North, including pulpits around here, the sermons identified Lincoln with the Messiah who was the Lamb of God who sacrificed himself for the sake of the nation, the salvation of the nation, salvation through death, salvation through destruction. And the Civil War defined that. Through the destruction of the Civil War, we became a people. The United States stopped being a plural noun and became a singular noun, only then. Sacrifice, violence, an inch below the surface, Jerusalem. So, Israelis, Palestinians. I guess one of my important points here is, before we condescend to those two peoples who find it impossible for various reasons to bring their conflict to resolution, we should understand that there's an unnamed third party to that conflict. And it's us. It's the West. It's Western civilization. It's Orientalism on one side. It's anti-Semitism on another. Contempt for Jews, contempt for colonized Arabs. Done in the name of God in both cases. So that's actually, in sum and finally, what's at stake, really, in Jerusalem. And it's not unrelated that Jerusalem is also the ground zero of the nuclear threat now, in some part because of Israel's own, not to be spoken of, nuclear arsenal, which are called, by the way, the temple weapons, which of course generates the pressure toward nuclear proliferation, beginning probably with Iran, spreading who knows how and how quickly to other nations in the region, already, of course, coming to Pakistan. Israel has every right to be terrified of nuclear weapons. The terror should begin with Israel's own nuclear weapons. And the Palestinian demand for justice, the demand simply that the Nakba be understood as their annihilation, too. So the interruptions in history that have changed this old city and changed its meaning in a very particular way, Auschwitz and Hiroshima, but also in a very powerful way, the terrible tradition of white racist imperial colonialism, exacerbated by the discovery of oil just when the engines of Western economics needed it. And happily, a movement that seems, let's be hopeful about it, may be coming into its last act now. So Jerusalem, obviously, it's two cities. There's a mess of Jerusalem, which I identified with when I brought the mess of my young priesthood there in 1973. And there's the glory of Jerusalem, which has been a place of self-surpassing for human beings now for thousands of years, which is why we love it, why we fear it, but also why we need it still. So Jerusalem, that's it.